The message arrived while I was reviewing a data pipeline that refused to admit it had bottlenecks. It was late afternoon, and the office air had that recycled taste that reminds you how many people have breathed the same ambitions in the same cube of space. My name is Daniel Holt. I work on the kind of systems that move information under cities of dashboards. If you asked my team to describe me, they would probably say that I am patient with code and impatient with stories that do not line up. I saw the message and felt a small draft pass through the day. The sender was an old friend who works 2 floors above my wife Sienna at her company. He wrote that a travel voucher had been used on a weekend that did not belong to any client, and that the user of the voucher had been listed as a companion. The companion name was redacted in the file he had seen, but the time and the destination matched photos Sienna had posted of a coastline with a smug horizon. I did not reply to the message. I set the phone face down and let the room continue to hum. The habit that has kept me from breaking too often is the habit of not jumping. I have learned that feelings are like birds at a highway rest stop. They will scatter and return so many times you cannot count them. The work is to pick up the map and move forward with a steady hand. I finished the review and wrote a note to myself to check the logs for a failed job that keeps pretending it wants to run at midnight. Then I walked to the elevator and let the day lower me 30 floors back to the ground, where I could breathe in air that felt like it had met trees recently. At home, the sky over the alley glowed a soft bruise color that my neighborhood seems to like. I poured water, washed my hands, and began to cook. Knives have a way of teaching the mind to stop pretending it is in charge. The simple arithmetic of onion, then garlic, then heat, can keep a person from running into his own shadow. Sienna texted that she would be late, and then sent a photo with a slice of skyline and a drink glass that claimed to be resting between tasks. I looked at the glass and remembered a night years ago when we had believed that ambition would be a kind of wind in our sails rather than a tide with its own moon. I plated food and covered hers with a lid and ate alone without punishment, because I have learned that solitary dinners do not mean a person is unloved. They only mean a person is eating. The next morning, I ran along the river, where commuter trains draw neat lines through the city noise. Movement warms parts of the mind that you cannot find with lectures. I decided that day to act like a clerk of my own life. I opened a new folder on my computer and named it with a word that did not accuse anyone. The word was timeline. I saved a copy of the travel voucher message into it after I had stripped the name of my friend. I did not want to risk him when the weather turned interesting. I began to collect what a court might call receipts, and what I call things that must agree with each other if they expect me to agree with them. I am not a private investigator. I am a man who is good at logs. The world records more than it intends. I requested my card statements in a format that made sense to machines, and I wrote a small script that highlighted charges that did not fit the pattern of our life. Hotel bars that sat on corners I had never visited. Out-of-state ride shares timed within a breath of hotel check-ins. Flowers delivered to a lobby with a name that points to a rooftop garden. A rental charged to a company card with a description that sounded like a secret apartment for people who want to act like they live in an episode. I did not allow guesses to elbow their way onto the sheet. I attached images, confirmations, and timestamps until each line could stand up on its own legs and say its name out loud. I kept living. I brushed my teeth. I made coffee. I answered questions at stand-up with the voice of a man who knows that honest work salvages days when the heart would prefer fireworks. I spoke to Sienna about a dinner with her parents, and she said we should delay because a new project was eating ours. She smiled with the version of her face that she puts on for meetings, and then softened when she saw me notice. There is a point when you can tell that a person is mixing emotions like paint and hoping the color they want will show up if they swirl long enough. I kissed her forehead and stepped aside so she could leave without needing to choose a different story. I called Petra. She is counsel for people who do not perform rage. She asked me for facts, and she made sure that I understood the difference between what I knew and what I wanted to know. I told her about the travel voucher, the card logs, the hotel bar, the rooftop garden that keeps appearing on Sienna feed. I told her about Sienna Boss, a man named Adrian who enjoys being a noun people insert into stories to make them sound expensive. Petra listened and took notes in a rhythm that feels like a porch when rain has decided to be helpful. She told me that if we were heading for divorce, we would do it with clean paper and no surprises that could catch my feet. She told me to move all discretionary spending to an account with my name only, and to maintain funding for shared obligations so that I would not be accused of making a mess to force a story. She told me to keep all communication with Sienna in writing once I chose a day to stop playing normal. She told me that if company resources were involved, we would speak to human resources with a packet that could not be ignored. I went home and did those things. I opened a new account, adjusted auto payments, documented balances, and took screenshots with timestamps, obvious even to a person with no patience for pixels. Sienna continued to live, as if promotions were a weather system that had chosen her street. She invited me to the company summer party on a rooftop downtown. She said the theme would be light, and that people would laugh, and that there would be photos under string bulbs for the internal newsletter where everyone pretends to be a family. I accepted the invitation and wrote the date on the paper calendar in the kitchen, because sometimes you need to see letters inked on fiber to believe that an event is large enough to carry your plan. The weeks between now and then taught me the extent of what the world records. An access log at the company gym showed timestamps that ran shoulder to shoulder with hotel invoices. A loyalty program email placed Sienna and Adrian in the same city on a weekend that did not have a client name attached. A rideshare driver uploaded a photo from the passenger seat that reflected a bracelet Adrian wears in public as if it were a graduation. No single item would have mattered if it stood alone. Together they described a conversation that did not need words. I made the conversation into a packet with a cover sheet that listed sections and a short summary at the end that avoided adjectives. I wrote the sentence that mattered to me more than any other. This is a record of choices that were made by adults with access to other choices. The day of the party arrived, carrying heat. Chicago does a certain kind of summer that turns metal into a low note you can feel through shoes. I dressed simply, a shirt that fit, slacks that did not apologize for being slacks, shoes that allowed a man to stand for hours without making his feet write a complaint. I packed 2 folders in a messenger bag. The first was for Sienna. It contained the timeline, the receipts, the images in which reflections betray people who believe glass loves them. The second was for HR. It contained the same items, plus a cover letter that addressed policy and liability, and gave a person who wants to keep a job a clear path to the right reaction. Before I left the house, I poured water into a glass and held it in both hands and stood by the window. Streets were making deals with Sky, and Sky was pretending to be indifferent. I told myself out loud what I would do. I would walk into a room full of people. I would say one paragraph to Sienna and to Adrian within earshot of others who matter. I would hand them the folder and I would leave. I would not yell. I would not be pulled into a script that I did not write. I would not allow anyone to touch me. I would not search for faces to agree with me. Agreement is not a victory. Accuracy is the only victory that lasts. The rooftop had been decorated by someone who still believes string lights can save souls. People were dressed in their summer versions of ambition. Sienna found me near the bar and kissed my cheek and introduced me to 3 colleagues as if we were playing parts from an earlier season. Adrian hovered in the orbit of his own grin. He shook my hand like a man who has never examined the idea of restraint. I counted my breaths and asked my body to remember the plan. The city around us played horns and tires and tiny bursts of laughter that do not belong to anyone in particular. My friend who had sent the first message nodded to me from a cluster of people who prefer to watch without being caught watching. When the speeches began, and the attention of the room had a focal point, I moved to the edge of the crowd and waited for the pivot. I needed a moment when the sound fell and the eyes that love gossip more than napkins were ready to be fed. The head of marketing finished her toast. People clapped. The music softened. I walked to Sienna and asked if we could speak with Adrian for a minute. She smiled, thin, and said sure. I could tell she was calculating which face to wear. We stepped toward a railing where the skyline pretends to bless all of this with beauty. A few people near us arranged their bodies into the shape of curious. I said my paragraph. I kept my voice low and my words sharp without being jagged. I told them that I had a timeline and that it contradicted the story I had been asked to accept. I told them that company funds and perks were involved. I told them that my packet for HR was complete and that I would be filing it tomorrow morning. I told Sienna that I was filing for divorce and that counsel would be in touch with instructions for access and retrieval. I told Adrian that the company policy on relationships between managers and direct reports is not a poem to be interpreted. It is a sentence with a period at the end. Sienna attempted to shake her head in a way that would make time reverse. Adrian opened his mouth and then closed it, as if he had discovered a sliver of wisdom that wanted to live. I reached into the bag and handed each of them a slim folder. I did not release the folders until I saw both sets of hands hold them securely. Then I took a step back and said the last line that mattered. I said that I was leaving and that there would be no argument here. My friend at the edge of the circle coughed in a way that told me he was ready to shepherd me to the elevator if the air tried to grow teeth. No one followed. People watched. People always watch. But the room did not become a stage because I refused to feed it lines. The night air in the street felt like a favor. I walked 3 blocks before I allowed my muscles to change shape. Relief is a quiet animal when you have asked it to wait until you are alone. I took a train home and sat by the window. The city moved past like an old film. I thought about the version of myself who would have shouted and cried and demanded the party choose sides. That version would have found short comfort and long regret. I chose paperwork and gravity. By the time the train slid under its last stretch of iron, I felt like a ledger that had finally been reconciled. At home, I wrote 2 emails. The first went to Petra. It contained a photo of the event invitation and a summary of what I had done. The second went to the HR general inbox at Sienna Company with a subject line that included policy code numbers and a phrase that makes people sit up straighter. I attached the packet. I copied myself and I pressed send without hovering. Then I set my phone face down and washed my face and stood at the bathroom mirror without asking it to tell me anything. Mirrors are notorious for lying to people who beg. Sienna did not come home that night. In the morning, I packed a small bag and went to a hotel near the office because the house needed a break from both of our histories. Petra called at 9 and told me we would file by noon. She had already prepared the petition. I would sign electronically. She would request a temporary order to preserve assets. She would ask for a constructive trust to recover funds used for the affair. She would include a notice to the company requiring preservation of any records related to travel, loyalty programs, credits, and receipts. She would ask the court for a protective structure for communication that would keep us both from turning the process into a bonfire. At 10, HR replied with a request for a meeting. The message used the careful tone people use when they are deciding if they are about to be blamed for something one of their colleagues has done. I offered 2 time slots. Petra asked for permission to join. I said yes and sent the calendar invite. At noon, I signed the petition. The signature slid onto the page like a boat into a lake that has been waiting for spring. I ate a sandwich in a park that pretends it can hold back the noise of 90,000 tires. Then I returned to the office and did my job because payroll does not pause for heartbreak. The HR meeting took place in a room with glass on 3 sides and a ficus plant that looked tired of carrying secrets. Petra joined from a distant room full of smart silence. The HR director asked me to walk through the packet, and I did, keeping my sentences at the length that papers use when they want to be taken seriously. She asked whether I had any intent to pursue a claim against the company. I said my intent was to protect myself and to inform them of risks to their policy, their brand, and their people. I told her I saw no reason to punish an entire payroll for the choices of 2 people who thought they were clever. She relaxed a centimeter. She thanked me for the clarity of the record. She said the company would open an investigation immediately and that I would not be contacted further unless required. She said she was sorry for my situation with a voice that did not use the word like a sponge to soak up her own discomfort. I appreciated that. I went home that night to a kitchen that had memorized where the light falls at 8. I cleaned the counter and wiped the table and set the folder I had used at the party on the bench by the door. Sienna texted that she would pick up a few items. I replied that a retrieval service could escort her tomorrow at a time Petra would arrange. There are sentences that close doors without slamming. I have learned to like those sentences. They are like the way a careful person ends a call. With a goodbye that does not try to pretend it is poetry. The retrieval happened the next afternoon. 2 professionals in neutral clothing stood by as Sienna packed. She did not speak to me. I did not speak to her. She placed clothes and shoes and a box of memorabilia into bags that looked new. When she was done, she stood by the door for a second longer than seemed necessary. Then she left. The house released a breath. I let it. I am not proud of the fact that I felt relief. I am grateful for it. Relief is the opposite of denial. It says the quiet part without needing to say it out loud. Days arranged themselves into a pattern. Work, food, sleep that improved from broken to decent to generous. I ran along the river and learned which cobblestones demand respect from ankles. I watched a hawk circle above a park and descend with a confidence that belongs only to creatures that do not lie to themselves. Petra sent updates. The court granted the temporary order to preserve assets. The constructive trust filing had been set for a hearing. HR had placed Adrian on administrative leave and had restricted Sienna access to certain systems while they reviewed travel and expense logs. The words administrative leave are more powerful than people admit. They are a polite way to say that a company is now a room where your chair is being audited in your absence. News traveled. People you assume never notice anything noticed. A colleague sent a message saying that if I needed a couch, he had one. And I realized that I had joined a club no one advertises. A neighbor asked if everything was fine with the building and used the tone that means I heard shouting from someone else, and I hope it was not you. I told him that the building was safe and that I was fine. Both statements were true. On a Saturday, I visited my mother, and she did not ask questions she did not need answers to. She cooked, and I ate, and she told me a story about a roof leak from years ago that had hidden damage for a long time and then revealed itself all at once after a storm. She did not need to explain the metaphor. I already live in it. The hearing for the Constructive Trust took place in a room that believes in cold air and straight lines. Petra presented a file that weighed more than it looked. She spoke about hotel receipts and flight credits and loyalty points and rideshares charged to accounts with lines that run into a payroll. She presented the timeline and the lines that show where Sienna and Adrian chose to take from a pool that did not belong to them. The judge listened with a face that did not reveal which way the mind inside it would decide to turn. Sienna counsel argued that the expenses were personal and that no company assets had been used. Petra then placed the voucher record on the table and the airline record and the photo of the bracelet reflection, and I watched the temperature in the room drop by a degree. The order granted us a portion of what we asked for. enough to keep the ledger from smirking at me when I see it. After the hearing, I walked along a block that sells suits to men who believe fabric can absolve anything. I looked at displays that tried to convince me that adulthood is a matter of the right lapel. Then I bought a small notebook and a pen that writes clean lines, and I sat in a coffee shop that knows how to steam milk without pretending it is a form of magic. I wrote the words that would become my new rules. Do the work. Keep the record. Refuse the stage. Call your mother. Feed your body. Sleep when the day ends. Breathe when it begins. These rules are not profound. They work better than anything profound I have tried. HR concluded their investigation 2 weeks later. Adrian was terminated for cause, a phrase that packs an entire movie into 4 words. Sienna was reassigned, while further review of her expenses continued. I received a short letter thanking me for my professionalism and confirming that my concerns had been addressed. The letter did not make me feel triumphant. It made me feel like a person who had taken care of his side of a shared street. That is the most a city can ask of you. That is the most a life can ask as well. Sienna reached out through counsel asking for a meeting to discuss a path forward that did not sound like divorce. She used words like pause and heal and rebuild. I asked Petra to respond with the same vocabulary that had carried me through this without breaking plates. The response said that the petition would proceed, that an equitable division would be negotiated, and that any attempt to frame the matter as a misunderstanding would not be entertained. The response also included a paragraph about messages Sienna had sent to friends that maligned my character. Petra included a request that such narratives stop, along with a gentle reminder that defamation wears a suit just like any other claim and can walk into a courtroom without tripping. I do not hate Sienna. Hate is expensive and throws interest charges onto every bill you pay. I am finished with the version of our life that demanded I doubt my own eyes. I took down 2 framed photos and placed them in a box. I left others. There were still many days when we had been 2 people trying to be kind inside the same weather. I do not intend to erase those days. I intend to put them on a shelf where they can gather dust without paying rent. Friends asked me how the confrontation had felt. I told them it felt like threading wire through a needle on a train. You steady your hand and you learn to ignore the sway. The important thing is not to stab yourself or anyone else. The success is in the threading, not in the applause that might follow. A few people asked me why I did it in public. I told them that I did not want to corner anyone in a private room where anger could grow teeth. I wanted witnesses and gravity and the kind of light that makes lies nervous. Public did not mean loud. It meant documented. A season passed, leaves changed, then surrendered. I taught myself to cook things that repay attention. I learned the names of bolts that hold my bike together and replaced 2 of them with parts that will not fail without a fight. I spent a weekend helping a friend move and remembered how lighter your own life feels after wrestling someone else's sofa through a door that hates furniture. In spare moments, I opened the notebook and wrote observations that mattered to no one but me. The way the river looks like a spreadsheet turned sideways. The way a bus driver waved at a kid who wanted to become a bus driver. The way a neighbor nodded to me as if to say, "Your house looks more awake lately." The divorce settled without a trial. Papers were signed. Accounts were divided. The Constructive Trust delivered funds back into a place where they could be used to keep lights on and to keep the future from thinking it had been abandoned. I moved into a new apartment on a street with trees that know how to shade a car without scratching the paint. I set up a desk that faces a window, and I placed the notebook in a top drawer that does not jam. Friends came over and we ate at a table I built on a Saturday with sandpaper and stubbornness. We did not talk about betrayal as if it were a hobby. We talked about a road trip we wanted to take and about a basketball team trying to remember how to be a team. Sometimes I run past the hotel that appears 3 times in my packet. I do not feel a desire to spit or to gesture. I feel a calm that seems to say that the building is just a building, and the choices made inside it belong to a chapter that has closed without needing a cliff. I do not avoid the rooftop where the party happened. I have been back there for another event with another company, and the lights looked less like a spell and more like bulbs on wire. The skyline is still gorgeous. Beauty does not stop working because people used it as a prop during a bad moment. On certain nights, I allow myself to think about the versions of my life that might have unfolded. There is a version in which I yelled and a security guard escorted me away. There is a version in which I made a scene that loved itself too much and poisoned my case. There is a version in which I pretended not to know and allowed my future to be built on top of a lie so heavy it would have buckled my ribs from within. The version I chose lets me walk to the corner store and feel like a citizen who remembers how to be useful. That is enough for now. I keep the packet in a drawer for reasons that have nothing to do with revenge. It is there to remind me of the power of proof. It is there to remind me that pain does not get to write policy. Policy is a set of sentences that carry the weight you give them. I gave those sentences the weight of my attention, and they carried me across a bridge I might not have found if I had been busy throwing rocks at windows. I do not read the packet often. When I do, I am struck by how boring it is. A boring packet can save a life. That is a rule I respect. I met someone new in a quiet way. We talked about music without trying to outdo each other with knowledge. We walked along a trail and pointed out birds we could not name. We cooked together and failed together and cleaned up together, and the failure did not feel like a test. I told her a version of my story that did not ask her to pity me. She told me a version of hers that made room for scars without turning them into badges. We have not made promises. We have made breakfast. That is a promise of a different kind. On the anniversary of the rooftop, I wrote a note to myself. It said that dignity is a utility. You pay for it by choosing not to be entertaining when entertainment will cost you more than you can afford. It said that anger is excellent at auditions and terrible at governance. It said that love cannot thrive where policy is a rumor. It said that a person who files his papers on time can sleep. I placed the note under a magnet shaped like a small house, and I left it there for a month, and then I moved it to the notebook where it belongs. There are people who will say that a public confrontation is cruel. I understand the reflex that produces that claim. The truth is that secrecy was the cruelty. Secrecy demanded that I become a character in a movie I did not fund. I stood up from my seat. I bought a ticket to a different story. I did not throw popcorn. I walked out into a night that had room for a man to breathe. I try to be kinder now to people who are clumsy with their own lives. I recognize the posture of someone hiding a mess. I do not judge as quickly, not because I think everything is fine, but because I know how easily people get lost when pride assigns itself the job of a compass. I have been lost in smaller ways. I will be lost again. I intend to get better at reading the sky and the sidewalk signs and the look on the face of someone who has decided to tell the truth, even though it will cost them applause. If I ever see Adrian again, I hope I am capable of nodding without grimacing. He is a man who made choices that fit a certain template of carelessness. The world is full of such templates. I do not need to fix him to fix my life. If I ever see Sienna again, I hope I can say hello without feeling the urge to tally. She is a person who found a way to believe a story that let her take what she wanted from 2 accounts at once. I hope she finds a different currency. I hope she learns the price of absence in exact dollars. I hope she saves up for a different form of wealth. I am asked sometimes what the single most important action was. I say it was the decision to write. I wrote everything down. I wrote times and places and sums and faces and rooms and light. Writing kept me from becoming a rumor to myself. Writing kept me from trusting the theater that lives behind the eyes when they are tired. Writing carried me across days that would have been torn up by the roots if I had allowed them to be managed by adrenaline alone. I recommend writing to anyone who wants to survive a story that wants to swallow them. The rest is quiet. I get up, I run, I work, I cook, I sleep. I attend to the small bolts that hold my days together. I do not need more plot right now. I need strength. Strength grows in simple soil. It grows well when you water it routinely and turn it toward light and refuse to step on it for sport. On weekends, I ride a bike to the lake and sit with a sandwich and watch the water make a case for patience. The case is strong. I accept it. I go home and clean the kitchen and call my mother. I turn off lights. I let night do its job. The rooftop is still there. The city is still there. I am still here. That is enough to begin again whenever I need to. And when I do begin, I plan to keep the same rules. Do the work. Keep the record. Refuse the stage. Call your mother. Feed your body. Sleep when the day ends. Breathe when it begins. These rules carried me through a public moment that could have turned me into a spectacle. They delivered me instead into a private life I can live with. Winter arrived with a clean edge, and the sidewalks learned to speak in a new vocabulary. I learned where black ice prefers to hide and how the wind finds gaps in a scarf. I did not mind the cold. Cold is honest. It does not pretend to be anything other than what it is. On long runs, my breath made small ghosts in the air, and I greeted them like old co-workers who do not ask for gossip. Work shifted into a season of deliveries, and I discovered again how a team becomes a choir when deadlines demand harmony. We deployed a migration without ceremony, and the quiet success felt better than any party. I wrote a note of thanks to a junior engineer who had carried more weight than his title claimed he could. He wrote back and said the note had made his week. I realized how low the cost can be for something that changes a day. I spent a few evenings repairing a chair that had belonged to my grandmother. The joints had loosened, and the finish had faded into a story about time that made the room look tired. I pulled the chair apart, cleaned the old glue, and set fresh dowels with clamps that believed in patience. When I reassembled it, the chair sat without complaint. I made tea and sat in it, and felt a line of people who had kept their own houses in order without expecting applause. A neighbor invited me to a small dinner and asked me to bring nothing but my appetite. I brought bread anyway, because I have learned that carbs can apologize for many conversational missteps. We ate and laughed and avoided the news. I told a story about a train delay that had turned into a quiet tour of stations I had never seen. The table made the right sounds. I walked home through air that smelled like snow waiting for an assignment. I cleaned my inbox the way a gardener clears a bed in the early spring. Old subscriptions went into a pile that would never be watered again. Important threads were labeled and filed. The empty space felt like oxygen. I promised myself not to let the weeds back in and knew I would break that promise in small ways and then fix it in small ways. Maintenance is a relationship, not an event. On a Sunday morning, I took a train to a neighborhood I had no reason to visit other than curiosity. I walked streets where the paint on porches tells you who lives with care and who lives with speed. At a bakery, I bought a pastry that tasted like someone had kept a secret perfectly. I sat by a window and watched a family argue and then reconcile over a box of crayons. I returned home with no purchases other than the pastry and the feeling that the city still likes me. I received a message from a former colleague of Sienna who had left the company after the investigation. She said only that she hoped I was well. I replied with a single sentence about work and light and the relief of systems that behave. We did not discuss Sienna. We did not need to. Some bridges are not rebuilt. Not every river requires a crossing. A cousin visited from out of town, and we walked along the lake with our hands jammed into pockets that tried to be warm. He asked me what I had learned. I told him that evidence is a form of kindness. It keeps you from harming people with your worst guesses. He nodded and said that he had been guessing about his own life and that he was tired. We decided to make a list of small proofs we could gather that would help us both behave. I taught myself a new recipe. It required patience at the start and heat at the end, and a willingness to stand still in the middle. I plated it without flourish and ate it without distraction. I felt like a man who had met a demand honestly. Cooking has become my favorite form of credible claim. Spring arrived with the sound of tires on wet pavement and the laugh of water escaping winter. I opened the windows and let the apartment learn new air. The plants perked up as if they had received a letter from someone they had missed. I mended a screen and promised the frame that I would treat it better. I kept the promise for weeks before forgetting for a weekend and then remembering again. That is how change goes when it intends to stay. I saw Sienna once at a crosswalk. We did not stop. We nodded like citizens who had shared a city and then built separate addresses. I felt no anger. I felt a small wish that she finds rooms that are honest with her and that she learns to be honest with those rooms. A friend asked me to help coach a youth coding club on Saturdays. I said yes and found myself explaining loops and conditions to a room of bright faces. They wrote programs that drew stars and hearts, and then they made the stars explode because children enjoy destruction in harmless forms. I went home grinning and tired in a way I like. I upgraded the brakes on my bike. The work required patience and a steady hand. When I finished, the levers responded with a grip that felt both strong and civil. I rode to the river and back and tested them on a hill that once made me nervous. The new system held. I slept that night with the confidence of a man who will stop when he needs to. On a long run, I found myself counting without meaning to. Steps, breaths, blocks, windows, signs. It calmed me. Counting has become a form of prayer I do not tell anyone about. The numbers do not change the world. They change my posture inside it. The apartment learned my rhythms. The kettle began to sing at the same time each morning. The mail arrived with the stubborn precision of a civil servant. Neighbors nodded in hallways, and we traded small gifts of attention. Silence felt friendly rather than empty. I wrote an email to Petra on the anniversary of the first call. It said that I had kept the promises I made to myself and that the rules were still working. She replied with a line about being proud of clients who become advocates for their own quiet. I printed the email and put it in the notebook, because I am training my future self to remember what worked. Sometimes at night, I think about the young engineer who wrote back to thank me for that note months ago. He has since sent 2 small updates about projects that shipped clean. I saved them. They remind me that encouragement is a lever that does not wear out. I want to pull that lever more often. There was a morning when the train stalled on an elevated track and the city made itself wait. People sighed. A woman read a book. A man closed his eyes and stayed present in a way that looked like discipline rather than escape. When the train moved again, the car felt lighter. Shared patience had taken a small debt from everyone and paid it off. I bought a small plant for my desk and learned that plants judge you without speaking. When I watered it on time, it looked like a believer. When I forgot, it looked like a witness. I began to treat the plant like a coworker who deserves a fair schedule. On a weekend, I took a bus to a museum and stood in front of a painting of a city at night. The painter had learned how to make light behave like a citizen. I felt seen by a room full of brushstrokes. I left without buying a postcard because I wanted the memory to live on its own terms. Winter arrived with a clean edge, and the sidewalks learned to speak in a new vocabulary. I learned where black ice prefers to hide and how the wind finds gaps in a scarf. I did not mind the cold. Cold is honest. It does not pretend to be anything other than what it is. On long runs, my breath made small ghosts in the air, and I greeted them like old coworkers who do not ask for gossip. Work shifted into a season of deliveries, and I discovered again how a team becomes a choir when deadlines demand harmony. We deployed a migration without ceremony, and the quiet success felt better than any party. I wrote a note of thanks to a junior engineer who had carried more weight than his title claimed he could. He wrote back and said the note had made his week. I realized how low the cost can be for something that changes a day. I spent a few evenings repairing a chair that had belonged to my grandmother. The joints had loosened, and the finish had faded into a story about time that made the room look tired. I pulled the chair apart, cleaned the old glue, and set fresh dowels with clamps that believed in patience. When I reassembled it, the chair sat without complaint. I made tea and sat in it, and felt a line of people who had kept their own houses in order without expecting applause. A neighbor invited me to a small dinner and asked me to bring nothing but my appetite. I brought bread anyway because I have learned that carbs can apologize for many conversational missteps. We ate and laughed and avoided the news. I told a story about a train delay that had turned into a quiet tour of stations I had never seen. The table made the right sounds. I walked home through air that smelled like snow waiting for an assignment. I cleaned my inbox the way a gardener clears a bed in early spring. Old subscriptions went into a pile that would never be watered again. Important threads were labeled and filed. The empty space felt like oxygen. I promised myself not to let the weeds back in, and knew I would break that promise in small ways and then fix it in small ways. Maintenance is a relationship, not an event.